PM chairs high-level meeting at his residence as a decision on extension or easing of lockdown to be decided. That's the big news at this point of time, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi is chairing a high-level meeting at his residence in the national capital. The decision on whether to extend the lockdown, which comes to an end on May 3rd, will be decided. Whether to go ahead with the lockdown or to ease the lockdown will be decided pretty soon. Clearly, the lockdown has not gone down well in terms of economy, but at this point of time, Prime Minister Modi is very much clear that to save lives instead of economy at this point of time, as Prime Minister Modi is chairing a high-level meeting at this point of time in his residence in the national capital. The topic of discussion is whether to extend the lockdown period, which ends on May 3rd, or to bring in more reforms and to bring in more relaxations, I beg your pardon. I have my colleague Pratibha joining me live from the newsroom. Well, Pratibha, clearly Prime Minister Modi has his task cut out. May 3rd is the deadline. Will he extend the lockdown period, or will more relaxations be introduced?
Well, that's a discussion that's currently underway at the Prime Minister's residence, Abhijit, and it's a very important decision that will, of course, impact the entire country. Now, the lockdown had been announced by Prime Minister Modi on 24th of March evening, and immediately after that, the entire country went into a lockdown. It was extended as well, and now the second phase of lockdown is also all set to end on March 3rd. It was extended until then, but what after March 4th? Obviously, April 4th, I beg your pardon. Obviously, things are not going to go back exactly how it was before the lockdown came in place, so that's going to be of key focus, but as of now there have been indications already from the Union Home Ministry that things would go back to normal, but in a very with a lot of restrictions in place. So the lockdown in effect will continue, but there are also going to be easing of restrictions to a great extent. So 733 districts across the country have already been divided into the red, green, yellow as well as the orange zone. So it is likely that based on these zones, based on the cases that have come from each of these districts, a decision would be taken on how many restrictions can be lifted. So that's what's going to be decided today. But of course, there's a mystery around it all because previously, as well as the lockdown was extended, Prime Minister Modi himself had also addressed the entire nation. He had spoken on what the situation is like, the importance of extending the lockdown as well. It seemed to be a very heart-to-heart discussion that he was having with the entire country. The entire country was glued to this address because it was so crucial. So the lockdown had been extended, but it came straight from the Prime Minister himself. But this time around, there's a bit of a difference on that. As of yet, there's no confirmation yet on the Prime Minister whether he will be addressing the nation or not. It's already May 1st. So, before it ends, it was expected that he will address the nation, but there's no official word on whether he would or not. So if at all, it would have to be either today or tomorrow. But there's no official confirmation yet on whether he will be addressing the nation. But before that, already we have the guidelines that have already come in from the Ministry of Home Affairs, and they have spoken about the lockdown in effect continuing, but with a lot of restrictions lifted. We do know that the impact that this lockdown has had on the economy. So a lot of discussions, and this had been hinted in the previous discussion of the Prime Minister with the Chief Ministers as well. A lot of this discussion was around having the livelihood in place. There have been several people who have been affected, so economy needs to be back on its feet. So that was a very important discussion that had been taken up. So now it's obvious that that would be the step that the Prime Minister will be looking at, easing of restrictions so that the economic activities across the country begin. But at the same time, it's also important to ensure that, now with the restrictions lifted, we don't squander away everything that we have achieved by paying a very hefty price by going through this entire lockdown that continued for over a month. So it's going to be very important that even if, restrictions are lifted, even if it is in the green zone, certain restrictions will still continue, like social distancing norms, the mask, something that Prime Minister had also mentioned about in his Mann Ki Baat. These are going to be the norms that we will have to continue. This will become a part of our lives. It doesn't matter if somebody is, any district is in the green or red zone. These are norms that will have to be followed very strictly in each of these districts, even if there are no cases at all. So, there are a few things that have been discussed already. Of course, a few restrictions have been lifted, including the stationery shops that had been open for a long time. But a few industries have been hit badly, and that also includes the textile industry that has been hit. So several industries, in fact, not just textile, but industries across the country have been shut, and only the essential services have been going on for all these months, so for all these days. So that will have to be lifted, and that would be something that is being looked at. Apart from that, interstate travel will also be allowed. This was extremely crucial. We saw the kind of crisis that the migrants were in because of the interstate borders being sealed. Apart from that, there were goods that were being carried out. Almost 35,000 crores worth of goods were stranded in the trucks across the country when the lockdown had been announced. So that was a massive amount, huge loss that has been incurred already. But now if the movement is not allowed, it could lead to bigger losses. So interstate travel is also going to be allowed. Of course, checks are going to continue in each of the borders, so that's something that's going to stay. Apart from that, there are several other educational institutions. A decision on that will be taken because the academic year, it's time for that to begin, and this is something that will impact the students across the country of universities and colleges as well as schools as well. So this is going to be a very crucial decision that needs to be taken. Apart from the fact that, of course, there are so many people in one place, so they will have to think of the restrictions, the norms to be followed before thinking of whether it should be opened or not. So these are the crucial discussions that have been taken up at the Prime Minister's residence, and after a decision is taken, a clearer picture on what would be the situation. Several states are also waiting for these guidelines from the centre. Karnataka, we do know, although it has ease the restrictions in the green zones in places like the red zones, and Bengaluru in particular, like we've said, Bengaluru accounts for about 87% of the economy of Karnataka. So it's going to be extremely crucial to look at what the situation is going to be like in Bengaluru. And as of now, the state has made it clear that we are waiting for the centre to give its direction. So that directive would come in from the centre after this meeting today, which is extremely crucial. So perhaps after the meeting, we will have a little more clarity on what the situation is going to be like after May 3rd, Abhijit.
Well, Pratibha, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has clearly stated earlier that the only way to beat this pandemic is to stay at home. Clearly, the number of cases are on the rise, and as per the WHO, the predicted number in terms of cases for the month of between May and July is 75,000, especially in India. So clearly, these numbers will be put forward to the Prime Minister by his team members, of course. And also talking about Karnataka, we have also seen the areas where their relaxations had been introduced. You did see a rise in number of cases. So clearly, it won't be that easy decision for Prime Minister Modi, isn't it?
Right. Well, it's a very, very crucial decision to make. Like we said, this is something that he has mentioned as well, that when he had ordered the extension of the lockdown as well, he said it's a very difficult decision to make because it is a huge cost that we're talking about, a massive loss that the entire country has been facing. And now, of course, it also came at a time when the Indian economy was facing a crunch. So it was a very difficult decision to take, but it does not compare to what we have gained in the lockdown. That is, thousands of lives have been saved, and the doubling rate has increased across the country. The rate of infection in the country has also reduced drastically. So those are some of the achievements that we can be extremely proud of. So we have achieved what we set out to do when the lockdown was put in place. But at the same time, the Prime Minister also stressing on ensuring that people don't lose their livelihoods. So that's going to be extremely crucial. Now, it was indicated in his previous meeting with the chief ministers as well. Initially, in the first meeting that he had spoken of about how important it is to save the lives of the people, after which he said, jaan bhi, jahan bhi, which meant that, we have to focus equally on livelihoods as well. In fact, several states had also indicated that we need to extend the lockdown, and while Prime Minister Modi agreed, he also hinted that perhaps we also need to look at livelihood. We've already seen the crisis of the migrants, and that is just one section of society. It has hit hard the IT companies as well, the IT sector, textile sector. So sectors across the country have been hit. So employees have also been affected by this lockdown to a great extent. If it is extended further, then livelihoods would be extended. To quote a few migrants who had been stranded, they said that even if coronavirus does not kill us, then hunger will kill us. So that's the kind of a challenge that the Prime Minister, the entire country has been facing. For a country like India, especially not having as robust an economy as perhaps a few more developed nations, it was a very, very tough decision to take, but it's an even tougher decision to decide on whether to go back or not. It's a huge risk, no doubt, to have everything ease back to normalcy, because there is a risk that everything that we achieved in the last 1 month would just go away in a jiffy if all the restrictions have been eased immediately, because the cases could go up. So anything that we have achieved in the last 1 month in the lockdown, even though it came at a very heavy price, it could go away. So that was the biggest worry, but it's also important to ensure that we're back on our feet, because otherwise this is going to be a crisis that the people in the country will not be able to face. So that's the reason why it's an extremely crucial decision. There has to be that perfect balance, which is why a few models are being spoken about. Like we mentioned before, In the green zones, restrictions would be lifted except for a few norms that have been put in place. That's going to be a part of our lives for several months to come. The restrictions would be eased. In the yellow zones, there would be a little more, restrictions in place. In the orange zones, it would be a bit stricter. And in the red zones, where the number of cases in the last 28 days has been quite high, in these particular districts, the lockdown is going to continue in effect, and all the efforts of the authorities would be focused on these areas to ensure that the cases come down. So, of course, this is a long fight. It's going to continue perhaps until the vaccine comes out, which could be 6 to 7 months away, perhaps a year or two away. The entire world is dealing with the very same crisis, but for a country like India, the challenges are very different from what they are for the other countries, and this is something that the government knows very well. So these are the factors that would be put in place, as well as the decision to whether or not to extend the lockdown and what are the restrictions that will be in place will be taken, Abhijit.